Well, the number of people suffering from depression is growing, and there's a major reason why. We'll discuss it next on Enjoying Everyday Life. Welcome to the program. You know, most of us either know someone who's going through depression, or we may have even battled the problem ourselves. You know, it's an epidemic that's growing, and we need to know how to identify it and what steps to take in order to deal with this problem. So joining me to discuss overcoming depression is clinical psychologist Dr. Linda Mintle.
Dr. Linda Mintle is a licensed clinical social worker. She's practiced biblically based clinical psychology for over 20 years, specializing in marriage and family therapy and eating disorders. She's an honored Staley College lecturer and assistant professor of clinical pediatrics at Eastern Virginia Medical School. Dr. Linda has authored 13 books and over 70 popular magazine articles. The Mintle family lives in Virginia.
Well, Dr. Mintle, it's always good to have an expert on the show. Somehow or another, if people think we're an expert, they're much more willing to listen to us. And so I think I've got some good things to say as a Bible teacher, but it's good for you to come along now as a medical professional and back me up in some of these things.
You'd make a good psychologist based on what I've heard you say. You're pretty right on with everything you say.
But, you know, depression, sadness, lack of joy, heaviness, whatever kind of terminology we want to put on it, I just find that so many people are not happy. And, you know, of course, some people just have even much deeper problems than not being happy. They have actual really serious problems with depression. And so, first of all, if you don't mind, because I believe there's people that are depressed that don't even really know that that's what's wrong with them. And I also think that there's a stigma attached to thinking that there's anything wrong with your mind or anything about you that causes you not to be able to handle life. And so what are some of the symptoms of depression that people should watch for?
Well, let's go through them, but let me just confirm what you're saying. There's almost 15 to 18 million people. It's 8% of the population is clinically depressed. That's a pretty big number. But what's more surprising about that is kind of what you're saying, is that 80% of those people don't get treated. And depression is very, very treatable, and yet people are not getting treated. Now, whether they're not getting treated because they don't recognize they have it, or they're just in that hopeless state and that sort of dark place in the soul that sometimes we refer to, and they're not getting help. But the difference is that depression is more than sadness. I mean, everybody gets sad once in a while, and there are events that happen.
Everybody has a bad day.
Right, and there are events that happen in our life. Somebody dies. There are things that, that sadness is an appropriate response to. But it's when that sadness persists and it doesn't go away and it continues. We say over 2 weeks, but it can continue even longer than that. Right. You can have something called a low-grade depression that goes on for a year or two. It's called dysthymic disorder. You can have a major depressive episode where there's something that happened that's pretty traumatic, you know, like a death in the family or something that happened to you, sexual abuse or something where it prompts an episode of depression. There are biological forms of depression, like bipolar, where there really is a biological base to that kind of depression. And then there are depressions that happen as a result of reactions to a thing called adjustment disorder. So lots of different kinds, but they all have in common the persistent sadness that lingers and doesn't go away, the change in appetite, whether you're eating more or eating less. The disruption of sleep is another one, where you're sleeping more than you should be sleeping, you can't get out of bed, or you're not able to sleep at all. Irritability. Concentration problems, that's a big part of it. When you just, you know, you're looking at something and you just kind of like, what did I just read? What? Because your mind is so fogged by what's going on with the depression that the attention span is just not there. So those are kind of the main ones to look for.
Am I correct in saying that sometimes people that are depressed will sleep excessively?
Yes.
It's kind of a way of avoidance.
Yes, and it's hard to get people out of bed. A lot of times people won't even get out of bed. They stay at home, which is the worst thing you can do, is to isolate yourself and to be more and more by yourself. The remedy, as we get, you know, we'll get more into that, really is to not stay in bed. But that's what you feel like doing.
Another thing that I find that people say is, I don't know what my problem is, I just can't seem to enjoy anything.
Right.
It's like,
Well, you don't when you're in a depressed state. You don't. See, that's the problem is everything just looks bad, and it looks like, and when you get to the point where you're suicidal, you really believe that there is no escape from anything that is happening around you, that there is just, it's like you get into a tunnel, it's like a dark tunnel, and everything starts to go south in that thinking. So you really don't feel that there's any reason to be happy about anything.
Well, I know we talked about some of the causes of depression, but if I was going to come to you today as a doctor and say, Doc, I'm depressed.
Yeah.
Thank God I'm not, but if I was going to say that, how would you begin with me to find out what the root of my problem is?
Well, the first thing is to always have a physical. So most people I would send to have an evaluation of physical to make sure that the root of your depression isn't something physical. Something we don't think about, Joyce. A lot of times after cancer, there's depression that sets in because of the changes with chemotherapy and the things that people have gone through medically. So there are medically induced, it's actually a category of diagnosis, medically induced depressions.
When women are in the change of life.
Yes.
And all those hormones are doing different things.
Yes, it's called PMDD, and a lot of women, that's one, the post-menopausal kind of depression, but there's also one for women that are in their cycles that's called PMDD that a lot of women don't understand. And 14 days before their period, they get severely, severely depressed. And we know that that's related to hormone changes. We're not quite sure why some people do. Some people are more biologically vulnerable to depression. But the treatment for that really is a very low dose of an SSRI, which is a medication that really helps people get through that 10 to 14 day period, and then they're fine again when the hormones reboot.
Right.
So there are, you have to look at this medically first and say.
I think that's very good because a lot of times I don't think people, they just feel lousy, they're sad, they're in a bad mood, and they don't even think. They don't even think that it could be medical or nutritional.
Well, and let me tell you a story of what happened. There was a woman in a church one time, and it was our church, and she was very, very depressed and becoming suicidal and was almost getting psychotic, which can go over into the bipolar area. But she was very, very depressed, and the elders were around her, and people were praying. They were laying hands on her, and they were thinking that maybe there was a demonic root or some kind of spiritual root, and they were just, they were really shouting, which I don't quite understand. We have to shout at the demons.
Yeah.
You just tell them to go when they're gone. But they were doing all of this, and nothing was getting better. And they pulled me in, and I pulled my husband with me, and they said, would you lay hands? Would you pray on her? So I started to do that, and I was really asking the Lord for discernment. What's going on here? And I felt in my spirit that there wasn't anything spiritual really happening with this woman. And I asked my husband to get some confirmation. He said, yes. And I said, I really think there's a medical issue here. So I asked her to go directly to the ER, and I worked with her with the doctor. And sure enough, she had taken some kind of weird cold medication and had an almost like psychotic reaction to it, and it made her suicidal.
Yes.
So sometimes when we think, maybe, and I'm not saying there are many times when there is a spiritual root to depression.
Sure, yeah.
And there are other emotional and trauma things, but sometimes, so the very first place to start is always to say, let's look at the medical side and let's rule out that there's
I heard
a
very interesting story, too, just recently. The doctor that I go to, who's a medical doctor but also a nutritionist, told me a very interesting story. She said that there was a woman who came in that had been fine up until she had her first child. And after that, she was just terribly depressed. I mean, so bad, like she'd been to counseling, she'd taken several medications, nothing was helping. The woman was just desperate. Somebody suggested that she come to this doctor for a full nutritional analysis. And part of what they tested in her was the level of iodine in her system, because this particular doctor has discovered that in the Midwest where we live, that there's a lot of shortages of iodine for some reason. And the woman was very, very deficient on iodine. And from the moment that they gave her the supplement, which wasn't even a medicine, from the first day she took it, the depression lifted, and she never had another problem after that.
So see, and I believe in I've seen a lot of that nutritional information, or in other cases, it could have been postpartum depression, which is very often not diagnosed. And that really runs the gamut from very mild kind of baby blues, we call them, for a couple of months, and people kind of work their way through it and they get better. to the more common postpartum depression, which lasts about 3 to 5 months, maybe 6 months, and you're really struggling. You're
and is that from hormones being messed up?
It's from all the hormone changes. But then there's that very small percentage of women, and it's like 0.1%, they actually have a psychotic reaction. And these are the women you're probably hearing about in the news, where they've threatened to kill their baby. You know, I remember when I gave birth, I remember at times thinking that I could harm my child. And I thought, where is that thought coming from? You know, what's going on? But the hormone changes that you're going through, and I remember thinking, oh, I know why people sometimes shake their babies, or they do. Now, I would never do that. Right, yeah. And I had the presence of mind. It wasn't that kind of depression, but I think it was a little of that postpartum depression from the hormone changes in the body. So we've got to be very careful that we look at all sides, whether it's nutrition or some other medical issue that's going on.
Well, isn't it true also, Linda, that just, I mean, I know when your serotonin levels are off, which is a chemical in your body.
Right, in your brain, it's a neurotransmitter.
That can really cause a lot of anxiety and our depression. But isn't it true that a lot of times that's connected to long-term stress?
Yes.
Where those things just, I think it's your adrenal glands don't function properly anymore because of the stress. And so here again, you know, you can't really talk about wholeness if you're not going to talk about nutrition, taking care of yourself, proper eating, getting proper sleep. You know, I think today we just run for the medicine bottle too quick.
I was just thinking of that. And it's not that the medicines are not helpful. They've developed some incredible drugs, and they're much more targeted now to centers in the brains that will hit that serotonin, will hit that dopamine, or whatever the part of the brain is that really needs the help. But to just run and get a medication, you know, the other thing that people don't think about is that talk therapy works just as well in most cases than medicine. So you don't always need, I'm not saying you shouldn't, you know, look at that, but you don't always need it. And, you know, there are other prescriptions. There are biblical prescriptions that have to do with the mind, where depression is a learned helplessness. And you begin to, you know, change your thinking and change the way, which is one of the #1 things that people do in therapy.
Well, one thing's for sure. Jesus did not die so we could go around feeling sad and bad and, and miserable and depressed all the time. And so for anyone watching today who has those problems fairly consistently, if they don't do anything else today, I want them to make a decision that they're not going to just sit by and put up with it. We're going to talk more about it as soon as we come back. We'll be right back after these messages. Thank you for staying with us. Welcome back to the program. Dr. Linda Mintle and I are talking about depression and what causes it, what can we do to overcome it, and just really making a decision that we're just not going to live our lives sad. I think it's, you know, what we were talking about on the first part of the program is so important that, you know, you need to take a more holistic approach. And what we mean by that is don't just pigeonhole, you know, this disorder all the time. Well, you know, I'm depressed and it's because I was abused in my childhood. You know, that can be the problem.
Right, but your response to that problem is what
but
counts.
But your response to that problem is what counts. And, you know, for example, I was abused in my childhood, and it left me with a lot of wrong thinking and a lot of bad attitudes. Well, of course, I was in a lousy mood all the time because I had bad thoughts and a bad attitude. And I think another thing that's worth mentioning is so much of my talk was negative. And I really believe that you can increase or decrease your own level of joy just by the way you talk.
Well, you are probably one of the best examples in America of somebody who really came from a difficult situation and constantly was in that negative mindset, who has really turned that around. And that is really the key to depression. It really is a learned helplessness where you become the victim, and and it's not to minimize people's pain. I don't want to do that because people have been through some traumatic things. But it is a choice to say that I am going to think differently. And I have to honestly do that almost every day, Joyce, because I have a tendency to go to the negative. I have a tendency, I'm one of those people who tends to see the glass half empty. It's interesting if you look at the research of the positive psychology movement by Dr. Martin Seligman. It's just fascinating looking at kids. And there are 3 things that we know about kids. If they are trained at an early age, if they see the bad things in their life as being permanent, That it's like it's always going to be bad, like I got a bad grade on this test, so I'm always going to get bad grades. That's just the way it's going to be. Right. Versus if they see bad things as temporary, and this is all in the thinking.
Yeah.
You know, if they say, oh yeah, I got a bad test, okay, you know, I didn't probably try my hardest, I can do better.
Right.
If you train a kid in that type of thought versus that negative thought, the child is going to be more optimistic. Secondly, if good things are looked at as temporary, like, oh, well, you know, the dog licked me because, you know, he was just in a good mood. Rather than, you know, the dog licked me because my dog loves me.
Yeah,
my dog,
right.
I'm a lovable person. My dog can sense that. You know, if you see that on the reverse, if you see good things as only being temporary, and that has a lot to do with the way we think about God.
Yeah.
And bad things as being, oh, it's going to be there, you know, no matter what, it's going to go bad. And then the third interesting thing, which was really interesting to me, was who's at fault. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that kids who think that they're always a problem. Now, if you think about it, we've got to balance this in American society because we're really good at putting fault on everybody else
right.
and not taking personal accountability. But think about the number of kids that go through divorce or people that have been in a divorce situation. If they're constantly thinking, it must have been my fault.
Oh, yeah.
Then they tend to be more pessimistic and negative rather than, okay, sometimes it's my fault, but other times it's other people, it's the way, you know, the situation, and it's not really something that I can always control. Those people do better. So optimistic thinking
right.
is sometimes trained into us, and a lot of us didn't grow up with the positive training. We grew up with the negative.
I was taught to be negative.
Yeah.
I was taught by my father not to trust people.
Right.
Everybody's out to get you. Anybody that's nice wants something.
That's right.
He was so negative about life and people.
And something bad's going to happen, so you might as well just anticipate it because then you won't be disappointed.
My attitude when I married my husband, that I've now been married to for almost 42 years, was this: if you don't expect anything good to happen, then you're not disappointed when it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, and then I had a tragedy. I had a brother killed when I was 17, and I could tell you my thinking really turned then because I thought, you know what? God doesn't take care of me. What's this protection stuff about Christians? You know, my brother was a Christian. He was on a plane. It was a terrorist bomb. They blew him up. And I was like, where was God in that?
Yeah.
So right away, you know, I started to say, you can't trust God. God is not part, you know, it doesn't matter if you believe in him or not. Terrible things are going to happen to you. And my thinking started going that way. And then as a protection from that deep wound
right.
and that deep hurt that I felt in the loss of my brother who I loved very much,
right.
that wounding, I allowed the enemy to come in and just start throwing those lies in my thinking.
Yep.
And that's what he kept doing. He kept saying, you can't trust God. He's not going to be there for you.
And the devil is such a liar.
And comes in at those places of wounding and hurt.
Exactly.
Why so many people who've lived through difficult things have that negative thinking then, because he comes in and he says.
Well, you were talking about how children take the blame for things that they have nothing to do with. Like so many children think if their parents get a divorce,
they're at fault.
Well, it was my fault. If I would have been better, if I would have been quiet, if I would have gotten better grades.
Right.
And I know my father sexually abused me for many years, and somehow or another, I thought.
You thought you were.
Well, there must be something wrong with me.
Wrong with me, yep.
You know, this doesn't normally happen to people, so must be something wrong with me.
Right.
And I had a record playing in my head literally for years.
And then you're damaged goods.
Yeah. What's wrong with me? What's
and then
wrong
you're
with me?
damaged. So
What's
why
wrong
would
with me?
anybody ever find you attractive or want
Right.
you when you've been violated like that?
That's why the Word of God is so tremendously valuable to people, because it renews your mind.
Yeah, and you have to
It
daily.
teaches you how to think the way God wants you to think. And there's a couple of things I'm thinking about that I think is worth mentioning. And, you know, something we hear all the time as Christians is let go of what lies behind and press on.
Right.
But you know what? That's God's way of saying, okay, you can't do anything about this, but if you trust me, I can actually work good out of that.
Right.
If plan A didn't work out,
Right.
he can make plan B better than plan A ever would have been because he's God.
And he helps us understand that there is a difference between grief. Grief when we have losses. And you know, we have losses in three areas, I believe. We have losses in relationships. We have losses of things like our health or our job. And a lot of people are going through job loss and financial loss at this point. And then loss of expectations and dreams. And so when you take those three things, there is a normal grief. And if you read through the Psalms, I mean, David grieved.
Yeah.
You know, people grieved I mean, there was a ritual of grieving in the Old Testament.
But they could only do it for 30 days.
And then they had to move on, and
By
that's
law.
the issue. Yes,
Yeah.
and so if you don't do the normal grieving, a lot of people are depressed because they've never allowed themselves to do the grief.
Right.
And they get stuck with not grieving. Sometimes the cure really is to say, let's go through that 30 days of grief, or that 6 months, or that really it takes about 2 years after a major loss to really get through the grief reactions. But if we get stuck in that and we don't do it,
well,
we try
I guess
to shove
God
it
had him on a
inside.
fast track because he only gave him 30 days.
That's true. That's true. It takes I don't know. I guess God is right, so I guess I can't argue with God. But it does take some time to get through the grief, and sometimes people get stuck because they feel like, I can't go there. I mean, that's the other side of it, is that there's the people that stay stuck in the grief, but then the ones who don't even allow themselves. And God knew the difference between grieving and then in the morning, there's joy.
Yes.
So he says, I'm going to turn it around, which implies that there is a time to grieve. There is a time to feel sad. But then there's a time for joy and gladness and hope and help. And so he gives us all of that stuff.
You know, obviously when we're hurt, we get angry. I think that's a normal emotion.
It's one of the emotions
of
grieving.
But the Bible says when you're angry, don't sin.
Right.
You know, we have to be very careful that we don't take things to that next level.
Yeah, we have to let go of it.
That becomes a real problem. And, you know, I couldn't do anything about the way my life started. I wasn't in charge of it.
Right.
But I can do a lot about the way it finishes. And that's what people have to realize today, is if they've lost something, they can't do anything about it, don't waste the rest of your life.
Right.
Because you still have a life left, and, you know, God can give you joy and he can restore. And, you know, God really does take bad things and work good out of them.
And it's your decision. I mean, you have control over your reaction. That's what you have control over. And God says, are you going to think on things that are good and pure and praiseworthy and noteworthy? He tells us, he gives us the prescription. You know, he says, put on the garment of praise. That implies that you've got to put it on.
It's on purpose.
Right. It's not like, well, I'm going to sit here and I hope it's just going to hit me.
Hope I feel better.
Yeah.
Wish I could laugh.
Yeah. But you can. If you force yourself to do it, if you decide to do it and say, I choose to think on something that is good and praiseworthy, and I choose to move out of that state. You know, it's easy to get stuck, like you said, in those places, but you have a choice of where your mind is going to go, and you have control over those thoughts.
Well, you know, Linda, for many years I was even a very unhappy Christian. I was even a very unhappy Christian in full-time ministry. And I finally just made my mind up. I mean, I made a decision. I am going to learn how to enjoy my life. And that's exactly why we call this program Enjoying Everyday Life.
Right.
Because Jesus said, the thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. I came that you might have and enjoy your life and have it in abundance to the full until it overflows. And he said, I want my joy to be fulfilled and completed and perfected in you. And so,
what an attraction that is to a world that is hurting and dying. And it's not to condemn Christians, but you know, as a Christian, we got to get control. We got to get a handle on this.
We really should be the happiest people on the face of the earth.
We should be. We should have the joy of the Lord as we're walking around.
And how attractive would that be to people to make them want that life with Christ? Man, if it makes you that happy, give me some.
Yeah, I want that. And that's why I think other religions are kind of getting ground in America, because they look like they might be happier or more content. But really, the true source of contentment and peace is really our life in Christ.
Well, I'm so glad you're going to be with us again tomorrow, and we're going to keep talking about depression. Something that I've heard you mention several times is bipolar disorder. And I was just kind of thinking, I'm not even sure I know what that is, and so there's probably other people. I mean, I've got a vague idea, but I'd like to hear you explain that more, and let's just get into some of the deeper areas of this depression and what people can do to recover. So we're certainly glad that you've been with us today, and hope that this program has really maybe touched something in your own life, or maybe has said something to you that you could use to help somebody else. God bless you.